to open the 6th plenary session on new partnerships for Asia-Pacific security. And we have an exceptionally distinguished, I would say even eminent panel for this 6th plenary session. It's a delight that Dr. José Ramos Horta is with us, President of Timor-Leste, a small country in Southeast Asia, one who is also an aspirant to join the relevant regional organization, ASEAN. We, as you know, always ensure that we have the perspective here at the Shangri-La Dialogue of big powers that play a role in the region, but we also give voice to the smaller countries in the region. Yesterday we had a very impressive statement from the Minister of Home Affairs of Fiji, for example. We are also delighted to have with us Prime Minister Kallas of Estonia. I like to say that in the last year or so, it's become evident that the geopolitical center of gravity in Europe has moved to the east and to the north. That does not mean that the power of the traditional Western European countries, Germany, France, UK, is commensurately reduced. But the center of gravity, to use also a Clausewitzian term, has definitely moved to the east and to the north. And as has been publicly acknowledged, as recently by President Macron in Slovakia, listening to the east and the north is now a geopolitical responsibility of those in Western Europe. A country who has come fully to understand and appreciate that fact is Germany. And so we are delighted that Boris Pistorius, the Minister of Defense of the biggest economic power in Europe, is with us today. As you know, the IISS is headquartered in the UK. We have offices in Washington, in Bahrain, in Singapore, but we are delighted to have our IISS Europe office for the last couple of years in Paris-sur-Platz in Berlin, only a couple of 100 meters away from the Chancellor's office and the Bundestag, so we're able to engage relevant leadership opinion in our conversations. And we have an excellent German-Australian who runs that office, Ben Schwer. So with that filibustering prefatory set of comments, could I please invite the President of Timor-Leste to address the 6th plenary. Thank you very much.
Good morning, all protocols observed, Excellencies. Our world is leaderless. Multilateral institutions are weakened, sidelined by superpowers. Those who claim entitlement to a place of honor in the UN Security Council, G7 and G20, have not shown the required wisdom and the leadership to forge regional and global partnerships for action to resolve the many man-made catastrophes plaguing entire communities and nations across the globe. Global challenges are not met with adequate preventative soft power strategies and action. Hard power tools available to the mightily rich of the world are not lawfully applied because the powers that could make a difference between war and peace are too busy squandering resources in narrow, selfish rivalries, each bent on regional influence and supremacy. According to Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi, every year in the last 2 decades, the annual wealth of the world has increased $30 trillion, and yet hundreds of millions of our fellow human beings in the global south do not have access to clean water, nature's treasure that is fast becoming a scarcity in cities and countries across the world. Shockingly, there is never enough money for clean water and sanitation, for sustainable agriculture, food security, and child and mother nutrition. There is never enough money for universal health care and fully equipped hospitals in most of the global south. Even in the face of tens of millions of fellow human beings thrown back into the agony of poverty, most creditor countries and commercial banks worldwide refuse to write off the debt of the now critically impoverished countries. We share the same planet, but we live in different global villages. Most survive in slums. Few live in Alice in Wonderland palatial homes. But we are all vulnerable, as the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have shown. If the Global South is not supported in meaningful ways to recover their livelihoods, no walls will be thick enough and high enough to prevent millions of destitute and desperate from continuing to flock to the privileged North. In the aftermath of the 2008-2009 subprime financial crisis, the instinctive reaction of the rich industrialized countries was to impose extreme austerity measures on their own workers and middle class, particularly Greece and Portugal, but at the same time channel hundreds of billions of dollars to rescue exposed European banks. Likewise, billions of dollars continue to pour into the Ukraine war and in support of the millions of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. However, there has not been similar mobilization of compassion to assist developing countries shackled by external debt, tragic consequence of COVID pandemic, commodity markets crash, extreme rise in shipping costs, inflation, etc. ODA, which has been dramatically reduced following the 2008 financial crisis, has not returned to the very modest ODA pre-crisis figures. If the global community of the rich across the globe wishes to see a fairer and a peaceful world, a world without extreme poverty and conflicts, every OECD country should allocate 1% of its national GDP towards ODA. But to a drastically reformed ODA that spends real money in the recipient countries with less legal and bureaucratic entanglements, less demands and intrusions, less middlemen involved in the chain of the aid disbursement. If the rich North wishes to regain the trust of the Global South, there has to be wiser and more honest and determined strategy to support the hundreds of millions who for decades humbly queue up for Western aid. Much of it was spent not in the supposedly recipient-needed countries, but actually spent on endless studies, missions, international experts, etc. Many in the Global South should bear also responsibility for our predicament, for not investing in our own people, in quality education, in health services, agriculture, food security, preservation of forests and water sources. And billionaires of the Global South should come together to support a Global South Fund for Education and Health, to support projects like bringing clean water to every community, sustainable agriculture, food security, youth employment, and eradication of child stunt and malnutrition. The Global South cannot go on pointing fingers at the rich North, a North whose own fortunes are less bright today, with an aging population, less young workforce, and less fighting men and women for their own defenses. The billionaires and trillionaires of the South and the North should do their part to share their mammoth fortunes with the less fortunate of our common humanity by investing in education and jobs for the youth of the South, to rescue Asia and Africa from environmental depredation and the climate crisis. This is all part of the new regional and global security challenges. Too convenient and unpersuasive to look at China with tunnel vision as a regional and global threat. China has spread globally. It is now a global power. Its interests, the well-being of its people, its security are intertwined with those of the rest of the world. I would think that China has every interest not to kill the cow that's supplying the milk. If my friends in the US and Europe wish to understand why so many countries around the world are allegedly shifting their priorities to China, let me share with you a conversation I had with an impoverished Somali diplomat in the Palais des Nations in Geneva sometime in the early 90s. The mighty USSR had imploded. Somalia had imploded earlier when in 1977, one of the Soviet Union's most trusted allies, the dictator Siad Barre, invaded Ethiopia's Ogaden province. The end of Somalia began then in the desert of Ogaden, and with it the loss of the Soviet Union, its most important footprint in the Horn of Africa, the Berbere naval base. The junior diplomat and I had become friends, and often over a café au lait in the Serpentine and an unattractive coffee lounge in the Palais des Nations, we shared stories of our misfortunes. He said in Resigned Fatality, I quote, "In the past, when the Europeans and Americans lectured us on human rights and refused to help, we just turned to Moscow. Now we are alone, nowhere to go. No one is helping us." It was believed, and actually it was feared in some quarters, that the collapse of the Soviet Union would have an unpredictable, contagious impact on China. Well, China survived it all. Fast forward to 2023. China is a true global power, a magnet for those disillusioned with the West. I haven't seen my Somali friend in a long time, but nowadays he probably would say, I quote, "We are no longer alone. Now we go to China," end of quote. Excellencies, while Asia continues to lead the world in growth and prosperity, dark clouds hang over our region, ranging from extreme poverty and inequality exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, man-made climate change, the war initiated by Russia against its neighbor Ukraine, food chain, international trade disruptions, commodity prices, external debt, nuclear proliferation, North Korea, South China Sea, Taiwan. We can continue to entertain the illusion that Democratic People's Republic of Korea may give up its nuclear weapons ambitions. But the DPRK is already a nuclear power, and I don't see how a totalitarian nuclear power would willingly dismantle its arsenal. Having said that, I submit that to help keep the peace in the Korean Peninsula, China and the US must re-engage at summit level. I agree that strategic competition is inevitable, normal, to be expected even between friends. We need a US-China partnership for peace in the Korean Peninsula and in the wider region. These should outweigh differences in other areas of competition and rivalry between the two superpowers. To help keep the peace in the region, the three Northeast Asian powers, China, Japan, Republic of Korea, should continue their mutually beneficial exchanges, expand trade and investment, expand people-to-people contacts, and find ways to overcome the bitter legacies of the past. The militarization and building of artificial islands for military purposes in South China Sea is inconsistent with international law in relation to exclusive economic zones, freedom of navigation. It creates mistrust, mutual suspicion, escalates tensions, and risk confrontation. South China Sea should be declared a zone of peace and cooperation, free of permanent military facilities, and all must observe the provisions of UNCLOS on exclusive economic zones. Outside powers should refrain from making statements and or taking actions in regards to Taiwan that are considered provocative and contrary to the clearly established reality of one China policy. We earnestly hope that the US and China manage their economic, trade, scientific, technological, and influence-seeking competition with serenity and wisdom so as not to weaken themselves as credible deterrents and guarantors of peace and stability in Asia and beyond. Excellencies, in the midst of global turmoil, I'm pleased to say my country, Timor-Leste, is a twinkling light of peace and fraternity. On 21st May, 80% of our voters went to the polls to cast their vote for the party and leaders of their choice among 17 political parties competing in the 21st May parliamentary elections. The election was hailed by national and international observers as very peaceful, orderly, free, and transparent. The Economist magazine Democracy Index rated Timor-Leste as the most democratic country in Southeast Asia, and Freedom House classified it as free. World Press Freedom Index placed Timor-Leste in 10th position globally. We are an island of peace, tranquility, tolerance, and inclusion. Political violence, ethnic and religious-based tensions, and exclusion are absent from our daily life. Our 98% practicing Catholic live side by side in harmony and fraternity with our brothers and sisters of the other two recognized religions in our country, Protestants and Muslims, who account for 2% of our population. Once ballots were in, thousands of citizens across the crowded open-air buildings, despite the heat, watched them being counted. Many of us from conflict countries know too well that ending conflict, restoring peace, reconcile divided communities, unite the nation, and governing peacefully is never easy. Some believe in the security approach, the use of force to deter and quell dissent and conflict. From day one of independence, we opted for dialogue to resolve disputes through patient listening, humility, empathy, forgiveness. For the victimized families and communities with deep scars in their body and heart, the words reconciliation and forgiveness can be offensive. However, the strength and motivation to reconcile with former enemies and forgive have to be found within ourselves, and only wise and inspirational leaders can help heal the wounds of the soul, inspire and help communities to free themselves from the shackles of conflict and anger. We have an exemplary relationship with all our neighbors, whatever the nature of past relationships, good and bad. Membership in ASEAN is a strategic goal for us. ASEAN membership, regional economic integration, peace, and inclusive prosperity is not only a foreign policy priority, it is very much a pillar of our national life and agenda. Timor-Leste now is an observer state with the right to participate in all ASEAN meetings, including summits. ASEAN leaders approved the roadmap for Timor-Leste's formal accession as the 11th ASEAN member state. Formal admission as the 11th member state may occur as we implement key milestones. Timor-Leste is firmly committed to undertake institutional policy and regulatory reforms, enhance human resource development, invest in strategic infrastructure that creates new opportunities for our economy and addresses common regional challenges in a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. This would ensure that our membership benefits not only our country, but the region as a whole. I thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you very much for that wide-ranging speech and your appeal for action to follow analysis, your statement that international law should be respected in the South China Sea, and also your appeal for more organized dialogue between the great powers who may be active in this region. And in advance of COP28, we also hear your appeal to understand the particular climate change challenges that countries like yourself suffer from. It's a delight now to welcome to the stage the Prime Minister of Estonia, a sign also as to the variety of countries in Europe that are now interested in this region. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister of Estonia will open the first Estonian embassy in Singapore. Prime Minister.
Distinguished ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's truly an honor to be here at the 20th Shangri-La Dialogue. Thank you, IISS and Dr. Chipman, for bringing us all together. The idea of Global Village was coined almost 6 decades ago. Since then, it has only become clearer how interconnected and interdependent we all are, especially with the rise of digital era. Our destinies are linked more than before. We have seen it with the pandemic. We see it in the connection of supply chains. We see it with the climate change and with geopolitics. Security challenges in the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic area are inseparable. For example, aggression by a permanent member of the UN Security Council against its neighbor, it's a threat that has global implications. That is why Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not only a European issue or a regional conflict. What is at stake in Ukraine are the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and international law, including territorial integrity and sovereignty. That is, the right to exist as a country. Make no mistake, in Russia's vision for security, it is acceptable to conquer and colonize another country. Its vision for security is completely non-compatible with the principle of equal rights of states. Russia does not accept the role of smaller states. It does not accept their independence, nor their decision-making power. It is a matter of global security not to let this vision succeed. Otherwise, we would all wake up in a much more dangerous world. Russia isn't typically thought of as a colonial power. It is commonly believed that there were no colonies within Europe after the Second World War. That is why we rarely hear about the Soviet Russia's colonial policy in the Central and Eastern Europe. Instead, Central Eastern Europe within the Soviet Union is often described in supposedly neutral terms like countries within the Soviet bloc and countries under Soviet influence. But what did this entail in reality? My own country went through Russia's colonization for almost half a century, up until 1991. In the aftermath of the Second World War, wider transatlantic community experienced a period of peace and liberation. However, for Estonia and several others, this peace marked the beginning of massive sufferings. Soviet occupation for us meant freedom and independence lost. It meant repressions, mass deportations, mass killings, which resulted in a fifth of Estonian population being either deported or killed. My grandmother and my own mother were put on a cattle wagon and sent to Siberia, and my mother was only a 6-month-old baby. Many did not survive the journey. In an effort to further their Russification policy, the Soviet Union deported Estonians and replaced them with migrants from the Soviet Russia. Russian occupation meant exploiting our resources and economy. Many nations have experienced colonialism, and they have seen the similar pattern of mistreatment and exploitation. I recall this because it mirrors the playbook that the Kremlin is using in Ukraine today. In fact, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a continuation of colonialist land grab policy that many thought had ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I recall this to demonstrate the human cost of occupation, the cost that those that would be left under Russian occupation, if the line were to be drawn in Ukraine today, would suffer. Ladies and gentlemen, truth is an important line of defense, and debunking myths is necessary to tailor a global response to stop Russia conquering its neighbors. For example, I'm reading with a deep worry how Kremlin sometimes succeeds in spreading lies as if its war of choice against Ukraine had been caused by NATO, or as if NATO members or Russia's neighbors threaten Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In fact, the absolute opposite is true. Russia's war against Ukraine has made it once again crystal clear why countries in the Central and Eastern Europe, after breaking free from the Soviet Union, quickly asked to join NATO. These are the actions of the Soviet Union and later Russia that explain why so many countries wanted to join NATO. The alliance doesn't exist to threaten Russia. It is for defending its members from it. It exists to keep tens of millions of people from being enslaved and slaughtered by Russia. Finland's and Sweden's complete turnaround in their defense policy is most recent example of this. With Finland in NATO and Sweden soon on its way, the long tradition of military non-alignment in the Nordics has ended. These were decisions driven by the sharp shifts of public opinion. These were the decisions made by the people. we have witnessed democracy in action in its truest form. And this all makes it clear that NATO poses a threat to Russian colonialism and not to Russia's security. Defense is not escalation, as you have said, Dr. Chipman. And as someone put it simply, if I install a security alarm in my house, it is not the threat to my neighbor, unless the neighbor plans to enter and break into my house. Language matters. Those who accuse of NATO of expansionism and escalation are adopting to the same imperialistic language and ideology promoted by Kremlin. The viewpoint disregards the right of smaller countries to make their own choices about their foreign policy, about their defense arrangements. It denies their independence and sovereignty. Living next to an aggressor state left us and several others with no other option but to apply to NATO's security guarantee. We would be living through some really dark times right now if we were not in NATO and EU members. So it is multilateralism and strong alliances that are yet another stronghold of defense, especially for small states. Ladies and gentlemen, the international community has given a clear assessment of the Russian aggression via the United Nations General Assembly. 141 member states have deplored in the strongest terms the aggression of Russia against Ukraine and demanded its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. For the majority, international law and the UN Charter are the first line of defense in protecting their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Lennart Meri, Estonia's president, the first president after restoring our independence, emphasized that for small countries, it is international law that serves as a nuclear weapon. Hence, upholding the central principles of international law are an existential matter to us. It is also basis for securing free, open, inclusive, and rules-based Indo-Pacific order. And it becomes increasingly important given that global confrontations are on the rise. I'm encouraged by the support of Indo-Pacific countries to international law and the UN Charter. Our host, Singapore, has had a principled response by imposing sanctions and explicitly expressing its condemnation and opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Not because of Russia, but because it's clearly wrong. Like Prime Minister Lee recently said, one country cannot invade another with impunity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a true believer in multilateralism, not only as a line of defense, but also a vehicle towards prosperity. As a member state of the EU, Estonia values highly the cooperation with Indo-Pacific. The EU's cooperation with the ASEAN is increasingly significant. And there are other threats and challenges we in Europe and partners over here are facing together. Threats from disinformation, cyber, hybrid attacks, economic coercion, and climate change are on the rise. The resilience of our systems, both digital and physical, are tested on a daily basis, as are international standards and common rules. One takeaway we can build upon together is that we need to build connections and set standards with those whom we can trust. The EU and ASEAN have a new momentum for further cooperation in the field of global connectivity and reduce dependencies on unreliable partners. That is why European Union's trusted connectivity initiatives will focus on the green transition and sustainable connectivity with Southeast Asia. Building new trusted connections must go hand in hand with cybersecurity. I see good potential for greater cooperation with the European Union and ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. In conclusion, closer partnerships is a great opportunity for learning from each other during these very turbulent times. These examples show how we can build prosperous partnerships together within the Pacific region and safeguard and strengthen international law together. We may be oceans apart, but our security is very closely connected. We shall continue insisting a full respect of the UN Charter and ensure oppression and tyranny do not prevail over freedom and sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for casting an understanding of recent events within a history of Russian imperialism and as an example of a colonialist land grab with a personal story also to draw from that I felt in the room was enlightening. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for citing my epigram that defense is not escalation. I hope everyone in the room will now cite your epigram that truth is an important line of defense. Minister of Defense of Germany.
Dear Dr. Chipman, thank you very much for the kind introduction. President, Madam Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. It is really a great honor to be here today, and I'm really glad to be in Singapore and at such an early stage of my term as German Defense Minister. Singapore, like few other places in the world, has made excellent use of its small size, its unique geographic position in the world, and of its resources. It has played its card very well, and that shows much more important than size is a degree of cooperation, networking, and globalization. Singapore is excellently connected to world trade, highly successful economically, and a place of cultural and religious diversity. The same applies to the Shangri-La Dialogue, an outstanding forum for intensive exchange among partners, open to the global diversity of views, positions, interests, and perspectives based on mutual respect. Ladies and gentlemen, in an increasingly interconnected and multipolar world, multilateral cooperation is key. In my speech at the Munich Security Conference a few months ago, I said that I am a child of the Cold War. But that is only half my story. I may have started my school career overshadowed by a divided continent and in a country whose security was protected by its allies. But I started my political career in my hometown, Osnabrück, a city in the northern part of Germany, as a mayor. And Osnabrück is a city of the Westphalian peace, the peace who ended the 30 years during World War in the 17th century. And the Westphalian peace still has implications to the world order up to now. And I'm shaped, as to say like that, by that history of peace in Osnabrück. And I started this career in Osnabrück in a unified country and a unifying European continent. Unifying and unified thanks to the engagement and the foresightness of our American allies, the European and international community and its leaders, led by the ideas of democracy and multinational cooperation. This historic achievement brought unprecedented peace, stability and prosperity to Europe and to Germany. But for too long, it also made us self-centered, especially with regard to Asia. For too long, we were focused primarily on economical relations, while not paying enough attention to the global political developments, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Over the past decades, this region has become a powerhouse in many respects. Emergent and fast-growing economies, closely integrated into the world economy, and a young, well-trained and educated population full of expectations and ambitions. Economic growth and success lead to political power shifts in terms of global trade architecture and technological standardization, as well as in questions of peace and security. it is very clear the countries of the Asia-Pacific are shaping the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, in a region of such importance, thriving economies and impressive growth rates have stimulating effects on the entire world economy. At the same time, any major tension or even armed conflict will have severe negative consequences, not only on the Indo-Pacific, but also on the rest of the world, including Europe and including Germany. That is why Germany is committed to contributing to peace and security in the Indo-Pacific, and we are ready to strengthen our engagement in the years to come. We want to actively support multilateral fora and institutions that we consider important for the peaceful settlement of conflicts. This is particularly true for ASEAN. ASEAN's ability to unite countries with a high degree of diversity in terms of history, ethnicity, religion, and governance is impressive. We believe in the centrality of ASEAN, with its reach far beyond its geographical situation. We commend ASEAN's inclusiveness with the many partnerships and fora that it has created in order to bring main stakeholders in and around the Indo-Pacific to the table. And we fully share ASEAN's unwavering commitment to the rule-based international order. In this spirit, ladies and gentlemen, Germany, having become a development partner of this organization already in 2016, joined the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia in 2020. During our EU Council presidency in 2020, we were equally able to establish the strategic partnership between the EU and ASEAN. As Defense Minister, I see a particular added value in the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. It provides an excellent platform to maintain dialogue with all important players in the region, including specifically the US and China. Ladies and gentlemen, today the rules-based order, which ASEAN, the EU, and so many nations of the Indo-Pacific and across the globe are committed to, is under severe stress. Russia's illegal war of aggression is a ruthless attack on Ukraine's sovereignty, its innocent people, and its brave soldiers. This war jeopardizes energy security, economic prosperity, and food security around the globe. And it is an attack on the foundation of the international security architecture and the foundations of international law. Principles we had all considered self-evident. Principles that, unlike pointed out this morning before, were not made by the powerful few, but were made multilaterally and inclusively to protect especially the many less powerful countries around the world, ladies and gentlemen. This is incredibly dangerous for the world as a whole. If Russia wins, the message to revisionist powers around the world will be that aggression and the unprovoked use of military force are acceptable, can be successful, also here in the Indo-Pacific. I am thus deeply grateful for the strong and swift support many countries of this region have shown in order to make it very clear to Russia. The global community does not accept this illegal war. With dedication, it is opposing any attempt to undermine the rule-based international order and any attempt to change the status quo by force, be it in Europe, in the Asia-Pacific, or elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, for Germany, Putin's war of aggression in the middle of Europe has become a historic turning point in our foreign and security policy. We call it the Zeitenwende, a tectonic shift that reaches far beyond our support for Ukraine. We have launched significant new investments in military equipment and will increase our national defense spending to 2% of our GDP. We are realigning our armed forces towards collective defense, including enhanced operational readiness and intensified military cooperation with our partners. And we commit ourselves to taking on more responsibility for our own security and the security of our allies and partners. This includes rethinking our arms export policy, in particular when it comes to supporting partner nations with a legitimate interest of self-defense. We must defend the rules-based international order no matter where it is challenged. And we have to stand up for the freedom of navigation and the respect of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. To a large extent, this can and should be done by a non-military means. In 2021, Germany joined RECAP, the agreement on combating piracy in Asia. We contribute to the International Fusion Center here in Singapore, which I had the honor and pleasure to visit on Friday. Germany also stands ready to support all efforts to promote bilateral or multilateral confidence-building measures, such as pre-notification of exercises, mutual invitation to participate in exercises, mutual site visits, inspections of military installations, or arms control agreements. In this vein, we welcome yesterday's offer of the US administration to enter into negotiations with Russia and China on nuclear arms control without preconditions. At the same time, we will not get very far if we are not ready to stand up for the rule-based international order, also by contributing with military capabilities. For example, when it comes to enforcing sanctions adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations against North Korea, or the protection of our sea lines of communication. To this end, the German federal government sent a frigate to the Indo-Pacific in 2021 and will again in 2024 deploy maritime assets, this time a frigate and a supply ship to the region. These deployments, I want to make that very clear, are not directed against any nations. To the contrary, they are dedicated to the protection of the rules-based international order that we all signed up to and which we all should benefit from, be it in the Mediterranean, in the Bay of Bengal, or in the South China Sea. Ladies and gentlemen, since I went into politics, I have witnessed how many countries of the Asia-Pacific have stepped up their cooperation with a unified and peaceful Europe. And many governments represented here today stand up against Russian aggression, united in the clear commitment and dedication to fostering cooperation, peace and stability. Such dedication and commitment are more important today than ever before. The global challenges we are all confronted with are manifold. None of us can succeed alone, and we certainly cannot succeed when working against each other. We need to keep engaging with each other. Even more so when the going gets tough, when interests and positions diverge, and when differences threaten to turn into serious confrontation. What the world needs today is multilateralism instead of unilateralism, multipolarity instead of bipolarity, cooperative security instead of confrontation. We need the rule of law instead the rule of force. Germany will remain committed to this endeavor, together with our partners in Europe, in America, in the Asia-Pacific, and across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Pistorius, especially for recalling the role Germany played in inspiring the strategic partnership between the European Union and ASEAN. I know that Vice-Presidente de la Unión Europea, Borrell, has already had some informal conversations here with the Secretary General of ASEAN. Also, thank you for your appreciation of regional structures like the ADMM+. Germany is not a member of the ADMM+, but you are a very valued member of the Shangri-La Dialogue, which we are in between. You're a full member of the Shangri-La Dialogue. And thank you also for reminding us that Germany's rethinking of its arms export policy is perhaps a less noticed but equally important element of the Zeitenwende to support the rules-based order in other parts of the world. So thank you very much for that important specific reminder. We now open up the floor for questions and comments. With the agreement of the panelists, I'll take about 8 or 9 and then distribute in proper proportions the time to those to whom questions have been principally addressed. Could I first ask Syahidrin Johan from Malaysia?
Thank you. My question is to President Ramos Horta. I thank you for your refreshing comments earlier, and I think it has given us a lot to think and discuss. My question to you is, in light of what you term as the failure of the rich North to assist the global South, what should the smaller, impoverished countries of the global South do together, collectively, to put more pressure on the North to do more for these countries? Thank you.
And from Brunei, Asua Saleh.
Thank you very much. As mentioned earlier by the Estonian Prime Minister, multilateralism and alliances were quoted as tools for defense for the smaller states. The ASEAN summit last year was momentous for Timor-Leste, as it was agreed in principle that Timor-Leste would become the 11th ASEAN member. My question is to the Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, where amidst the increasing complexity of the security landscape in Southeast Asia, what would be the areas of regional cooperation that you would prioritize and participate in upon being confirmed as the 11th ASEAN member state? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from the Netherlands and the IISS, Veerle Nowens.
Thank you, John. Minister Pistorius, over the last few days, we've heard from our speakers a wide range of destabilizing factors in the Indo-Pacific region. You have just mentioned arms control in your remarks. A few days ago, the DPRK launched a new type of ICBM against a backdrop of already heightened tensions. We see other countries, as a response to these types of developments and their own threat assessments, increase their own counterstrike capabilities as well. We've heard from HRVP Borrell that Europe, as one of the poles in a multipolar world, can play a stronger part in this part of the world, and so too can Germany as part of its Zeitenwende. What can Europe and Germany specifically do on arms control in the Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Thank you. And from the UK and also the IISS, John Rain.
Thank you, John. I was struck by the anecdote which President Ramos Horta told about his dealings with his colleague and the role which the Soviet Union played and China may now play, a hegemonic role amongst countries who felt they had nowhere else to go. I'd just like to ask members of the panel, how do we stop a silk curtain falling where the Iron Curtain fell?
Thank you very much. Another striking phrase that perhaps we should record. May-Britt Stumbaum from Germany.
Thank you very much. As a German, I want to congratulate you for the sizable and substantial delegation, which truly underlines that there's a Zeitenwende in Germany. And you mentioned that we have been too self-centered for too long with economic domination prevailing. Michael Yahuda called this the tyranny of distance and the primacy of trade. And it's good to hear that this is over. I wanted to ask, as you said, it is important to signal that we support the rule-based order and the international law. And you said it's two theaters have become one. What happens in Ukraine, what happens here, has signals worldwide. How do you see the Indo-Pacific deployment in 2024? Germany sent the frigate Bayern here. We had Rapid Pacific. But we have more signals to send. We heard the last days about other European countries sending their shipments to the region to show the international base order is here. UNCLOS is at display. Will we sail through that part that is so important for German and European trade, that is so important for our resilience of supply chain through the Taiwan Strait this time? Thank you.
Thank you. And from Vietnam, Bic Tran.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. So my question is for Minister Kallas. Estonia is known for having a strong cyber capabilities. And it has played important role in helping Ukraine to strengthen their cybersecurity. So I would like to know whether Estonia will increase cyber cooperation with South Asian countries, and if yes, how? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ben Schreier from Germany and also the IISS.
Thank you, John. My question is for Minister Pistorius. Thank you for your excellent remarks. In his remarks yesterday, High Representative Borrell rightly pointed out that countries in this region are still skeptical about the EU's security and defense role. He also argued that the EU is not a military union and that military means are not at the forefront of its strength as a global actor. This might imply that the Indo-Pacific really shouldn't expect a major strategic role for the EU in this part of the world. And so my question first is, do you agree? And secondly, if so, does that mean that individual European powers, including Germany, have to pursue a more national approach to defense engagement in this region in order to become more credible and to pursue their interests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from China, Jiazhu Zhao.
Thank you, John. My question is also going to Estonian Prime Minister. You mentioned that NATO is a defensive organization. Now, I have a little bit different opinion. We know NATO is a security alliance, that is a military alliance. The existence of a military alliance needs enemies, needs adversaries. So when it provides security guarantees to its members, but also at the same time, it puts its fingers to other countries, view other countries as threat, as enemies. So as a result, if we take a bigger picture, so what it has brought to either in Europe or in Asia Pacific is not peace and stability, but division and confrontation. So that is what it has happened in Europe and what it is happening in Asia Pacific. Why? After the end of the Cold War for more than 30 years, why the security situation either in Europe and in Asia Pacific deteriorated? So I think that is the reason for NATO or for US military alliance in this region. So I'd like to have your opinion or your comment on my argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Justin Bakisal.
Thank you, John. Following up from the question of the delegate from China, I would like to ask a question from the Prime Minister of Estonia. What do you think are the basic requirements for small countries to feel secure despite having a big neighbor? As we all know, a threat is not just about the intention of your neighbor, but also its capabilities and opportunities. So we would be remiss not to plan for all contingencies when we are beside such neighbors. What has Russia done wrong in the recent decades for its neighbors to remain fearful of it? And constructively, what might China learn from that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a couple of more. Shengor Aun from Cambodia.
Thank you. My question goes to Minister Pistorius. With regard to the German stand on Taiwan, in the event of the cross-strait conflict, what is the German position on the conflict, and how would German would see the German and European role in the conflict as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I will take even another couple more, and then each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to take it. They've each taken exceptionally good notes here, so I think we'll be well served. Alistair Gale from the UK.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Dr. Ramos Horta. You mentioned the need for a US-China partnership for peace. We're here at a meeting of defense ministers, but there's been no conversation between the US and Chinese ministers. There's also been a near collision between US and Chinese warships. How concerned are you that the US-China relationship is heading in the wrong direction, and what could that mean for your country?
Bastian Giegwig from Germany.
John, thank you very much. I have two questions, if I may. One for Prime Minister Kallas. Yesterday, the Swedish Defense Minister Jonsson said NATO supports its partners but defends its allies. And I was wondering whether, with a view to the Vilnius summit, you can give us your thoughts on what you would like, what kind of message you would like to see vis-à-vis Ukraine and NATO membership. And one question for Defense Minister Pistorius. So you spoke about changes you expect to see around Germany's arms export policy, and I think I venture, I guess, that piqued the interest of several nations here in the region, but possibly also some of the companies represented here in the room. So I was wondering whether you could add a little bit more detail on what those changes might look like, or what kind of changes you're hoping for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question in a second from Japan. I just want to give a tactical warning to our panelists to say that I will ask them to reply in the reverse order in which they initially spoke. So Boris Pistorius, Kaja Kallas, and President of Timor-Leste in that order. And with Japan, Mihoke Matsubara. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. So I have a question to Prime Minister Kallas, if I may. So the war in Ukraine showcased how crucial critical infrastructure services are in both peacetime and wartime. And I'm wondering if I'd be really grateful if you can share lessons that your country has learned from this war and how your government and critical infrastructure companies are now working differently together compared to before the wars to defend those critical infrastructure companies from hybrid threats, including cyber threats.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very glad I got one more question in, another subject to address. 5 minutes each. We want to end around 10:56. Boris Pistorius.
Well, I tried to make it quite short because there was a lot of questions, and I would like to combine the answer to the question regarding arms control and the question of export control. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that I'm not able to tell you more details because we are just in discussions in Germany. We are really in discussions because we experienced a shift of public opinion and principles of our security policy during the last decades. If somebody had told me 2 years ago that Germany would deliver heavy weapons, ammunition, and so on into a region, in a war region, I wouldn't have believed that, and I would have said it is impossible. That we do it is a real paradigm shift, and therefore we have to now to try to shape our new security policy also regarding the export control of arms. So this is our really challenge now. We have to fix it in our coalition, in the government. We have to fix it with the parliament and, of course, with the public opinion. So therefore, arms control and arms export control, we have to discuss together. Regarding the role of European Union in military guards, well, the European Union is, of course, everybody knows, not a military alliance, and is not a competitor to NATO, of course. Most of us are NATO members. So this is not our role, and I rather prefer to keep it like that. We should not try to make European Union a military alliance. We don't need another military alliance. What we need is a close cooperation with NATO, and we need a close cooperation between the members of the European Union and members of NATO, because we are depending on sticking very close together, especially regarding international conflicts and international challenges. And the last point is regarding and connected to that, Germany will be present in the future, not only in 24 as we were in 21. We will be present in 24 in the following years too, because we want to show our interest and our concern about what is going on in this region, and we want to show our solidarity and our being guilty some kind of not having it in focus during the last decade. So we will be present in future too.
Thank you very much. So perhaps, as they say in the US Congress, you lend 2 minutes of your time to the Prime Minister of Estonia. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just worried that I'm not sure I can make it in 5 minutes. I have many questions here, but I try my best. Try to combine those answers. NATO. NATO is a defense alliance. Of course, it's a military alliance. And when you ask that the military alliance need to have an enemy, no, it's defense alliance that is a group of countries coming together and really agreeing how we can defend ourselves better. And because we have existential threat, that is Russia. NATO has also said that out. But just to play out this kind of idea that NATO is a threat to somebody, then NATO is an alliance of now 31 countries. 31 countries with very different sizes. So if to say that NATO is threatening somebody's sovereignty or territorial integrity, how does that really play out? Because then NATO invades a country and then we share it amongst ourselves with 31 countries. And so you get a bigger piece, we get a smaller piece. I mean, that is ridiculous. This is not how it works. And as I say, I mean, as soon as we got out and the occupation stopped, the Soviet Union collapsed, our first idea was that we are never alone again, because it's a question of our independence, it's a question of our freedom, it's a question of our right to exist as a country. Therefore, we applied to NATO. NATO did not want us at all, so we had to work very, very hard to get there. And if we wouldn't be in NATO, we would be living through some really, really dark times right now. But we are, and that's why we are free and independent. And also a question of the discussion is around of spheres of influence, which is the topic that Russia wants to really have. That, okay, let's divide the world so that these are your spheres of influence and these are mine, like they did, Germany and Russia in 1939, which meant, great atrocities for my country, for example, because the world was divided. So the point is, the only security guarantees that there are for small countries is the end of gray zones, really. That we have big friends, and when we have big friends, then a big bully doesn't really bully you, because this is dangerous also to them. And what are the basic requirements for a lasting peace, and why Russia keeps on attacking its neighbors is we have to do everything to show that aggression as a policy tool cannot pay off. Because if it does, you invade a country, you take part of it, you take the territories, and then somebody says that, okay, let's stop here, let's draw the line, let's have a peace treaty, these territories are for you, these territories are for you, then aggression actually pays off. It means that if you invade a country, you walk away with more than you had before. And we have to give a clear message that this can't be the case, because then every country in the world and the international law is actually under attack. And what it requires is accountability. Why Russia does that compared to other countries that are no longer colonizing different countries is because they have never been held accountable what they have done. I mean, Germany has paid has been accountable for the Nazi crimes and really has the collective understanding of what was happening. It has never been the case for Russia. Russians don't know the crimes that they committed in Estonia or elsewhere, and so there has never been accountability like it was for a Nuremberg tribunal. Regarding Vilnius, of course, we support Ukraine's path to NATO's membership. Everybody understands it can't happen while the war is going on, but we need clear wording that is more than Bucharest. Then critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. In 2007, we were attacked by Russia by cyber attacks, and what we learned from there is to build the resilience and really invest in cybersecurity. And that is also a lesson for Ukraine, actually, because why they are able to deliver services to their country, to their people, is that they have built and invested a lot in cybersecurity over these years, and also security of the critical infrastructure that is actually much more difficult to do. But cybersecurity is of utmost importance. We are very focused on the conventional war that is going on, but even if that ends, the cyber war will continue. And what is the different understanding that we have to keep in mind all the time is that, hospitals, for example, a few years ago, they only had to worry about some drug addict coming and stealing the morphine. That was their security risk. Now they are part of the bigger security picture, and by a cyber attack, you can actually have civilian casualties because the hospitals will go out function. So this is why we have to do everything we can. And also there was a question how we can help other countries. As Estonia, we have and we are doing this all the time. Although being a small country, we have the cyber exercises, and it's also very important that we build the connections with the countries that we trust, the trusted connectivity, but also that we share information about the cyber attacks, because the others can't prepare if they don't know what is your experience. So I really call on like-minded partners to share information, because the bad guys share information and the good guys should as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's a certain charisma and clarity. Thank you for providing that. President of Timor-Leste.
I would like to clarify one or 2 points in my comments. One in regard to ODA. In fairness, the European Union as such, following the subprime crisis 2008-2009, did not reduce aid to developing countries. I refer to the bilateral donors that did dramatically and they have not recovered. And the UK, under David Cameron, was the only country, a G7 country, that in the midst of the crisis actually increased ODA to 0.7%. Can we imagine if every G7 country, plus other major powers like China, India, also increased to 0.7%? This is an appeal that's been made for the past 30, 40 years for OECD countries to contribute 0.7% of GDP to ODA. But since then, some countries, I don't mention names, literally no longer have a ODA. Partly the money relocated to conflicts, managing conflicts in Africa, Central Africa, in Mali. Some of the money redirected within their own countries from aid money to resettling, supporting North African refugees going to Europe. So, and in regard to Ukraine, I have to say, Timor-Leste is one of the first countries that actually condemned, and we did not only condemn my country, in spite of being poor, we contributed almost immediately with $2 million through the UN system for Ukrainian refugees. Because many countries in pledging conferences, they all announced great contributions. But in the end, when the Secretary General does the counting of how much money actually went to UNHCR, 30% of what was pledged or 30% of what was needed. So it is, I'm not overly romantic about that This is a whole humanity. We are all the same, well, but some are cousins and some are poor cousins. And there are quicker response to your first cousins than cousins in South Asia or in Africa and so on. And that is the disparity we see in the reaction to support Ukraine and to other fatalities. In relation to our role in ASEAN, first and foremost, it's not only now that ASEAN supported us. Way back in the beginning of the crisis in Timor-Leste, 1999, 2000, many ASEAN countries contributed with peacemaking, police contributing, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia had, although it had, at the time it was not in condition to help much, but it also had civilian personnel going there. And since then, a variety of support we have received from ASEAN countries. In November last year, the summit in Phnom Penh agreed in principle that Timor-Leste should be the 11th member. And then in the Labuan Bajo summit, a roadmap was adopted, a very strict roadmap, which we are working on with the support from Singapore and the other ASEAN countries, but also with pledges of support from Australia, New Zealand, European Union, United States, Japan, South Korea, China, Portugal, for improving the pool of Timorese human resources to meet the challenges in ASEAN membership, which is not only like meeting the challenges, actually respond to our own needs. Even if we were not going to join ASEAN, we still need those requirements for our own development. And Timor-Leste is, we are poor by most definitions, but we have made tremendous progress in the last 20 years. In 2002, we had only 19 medical doctors. Now we have 1,200 medical doctors. In 2002, we had one university. Today we have 16 universities and institutes of higher learning. We have hundreds of Timorese studying around the region, in Europe, all the way to Brazil. And our best contribution to ASEAN is we should not be a burden and a headache for ASEAN. So we keep the peace in our own country. We develop as much as we can. And I have to say, ironically, we might be poor, but we are an investor in international finance. We have a sovereign fund, which we created in 2004-05. Initially, all our money invested in US Treasury bonds. In 2009, we changed the law to diversify. The diversification of our funds, 40% diversified, several $7 billion, I don't mention the figure, have a return, given us return for the last 10 years of 8% a year. 8% in our more than 1,000 portfolios in equities. So we are an investor in the US, we are an investor in Euro bonds, we are an investor in Australia, but now we are going to shift more to invest in Asian markets. Because the US Treasury bonds pay us next to nothing. And we are not following the trend of moving away from US dollar. Our currency is the US dollar. It has served us well. We will continue with that. But we will diversify from an instrument that pays us nothing. So we will move more. So that's our contribution. So the best contribution, we don't want to be another catastrophe like Myanmar. And ASEAN has this huge challenge, and we will support ASEAN leaders and friends to the extent possible to resolve these challenges in our region. And so I think on the question from the UK on the South China Sea, in the beginning of independence, for several years, we had a dispute with Australia over our maritime boundary. Australia prefer that ancient theory of continental shelf, which would have meant all the way Australian maritime boundary would extend all the way to our coastal areas. But wisdom prevailed between the two sides, Timor-Leste and Australia, mediated by the United Nations under UNCLOS. And in 2018, we agreed on a permanent maritime boundary midway between Timor-Leste and Australia, based on international law. If it were not for international law, if we did not follow UNCLOS, if we do not follow internationally established rules, well, Timor-Leste would be a victim. We still would not have a permanent maritime boundary.
Thank you very much. By the way, on that last point, I think the last international treaty of significance between a European country and Russia was when Norway and Russia signed the maritime boundary also within the midpoint of a previously contested area. And the person who negotiated that is the Norwegian ambassador to London, who was also the Norwegian ambassador to the United States. And as a sign of how the center of geopolitical gravity is moving to the east and to the north, he thinks the next most prestigious post for him to have is as the Norwegian ambassador to Finland, a position he's taking up in August, an interesting factoid. On Friday, I said that the Shangri-La Dialogue, being an informal intergovernmental event organized by the independent IISS, is able to introduce fresh, vital, and new perspectives into the debate from a growing diversity of countries. We have had this on this panel. I have learned a great deal. You will have learned a great deal. Please thank our panelists for adding to our knowledge. Thank you.